and welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had an enjoyable break. I'm now pleased to introduce our next session on sustaining inclusive excellence, the impacts of accelerating online education with Dr. Wendy Purcell, who is a full professor at Rutgers University and an academic research scholar with Harvard University. I turn it over to you, Dr. Purcell.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shannon. And thank you so much for the invitation to join this conference. I'm learning a lot and great pleasure to talk to you. I think the first thing I want to say is just to recognize that what we do here in higher education really matters. And just to take a moment when everything is getting, chaotic and there's so many things that are going on for us, just to kind of ground ourselves and remind ourselves that the work we do here matters. It matters because we're changing people's lives. It's important work, it's honorable work. And I think the way that we now are thinking through these changes around online education and really focusing on inclusion and sustaining excellence is some really important work to do. But we're doing it at a time, I think, of unprecedented changes across the world. I mean, just on this slide, you'll see the number of different fronts that we're experiencing change at pace. And I think there's never been a time in human history when there's been so much change across so many different fronts at the same time. So this really is a moment. It's a moment in our history, but it's a moment for higher education really to lean in to support the kind of developments that we need when we think about our workforce, when we think about solutions, when we think about education. So I think it was captured beautifully in the most recent Global Risks report that talked about this being a critical inflection point. And I think we can use that to think about how this is a critical inflection point for higher education. And how we can play our fullest role with respect to creating a world that leaves no one behind. That sense of our responsibilities and how the tools that we work with can really help us do that, reach more people, reach them in ways that make sense to them as individuals and reflect, I think, the societal needs that we are aware of now and that are coming down the track. I think we're also aware as we look at those threats, those risks, that critical inflection point, that there are exacerbating inequities, that we see this, we know this in higher education. And I think we are reawakened, I think, to some of these inequities now. With the polarization in many countries that we're seeing around access, around wealth, and around health, as well as education. So we're experiencing disruption across a range of different fronts. We saw that, and I'm going to talk a little about, as other speakers have done, the COVID disruption to higher education and where we are now, but as well as, war in Ukraine, sort of growing threats globally, as I say, the reawakening around social justice issues, and then some very real fears around cost and price as we think about, a looming potentially global recession, inflationary pressures, and so on. So I think higher education itself is not immune from these kinds of buffeting that's happening around these global trends. We saw that when we took, a couple of years ago now, we looked out far through to 2030 and thought, what are these trends that are showing up for us in higher education? And I think we added, the first 8 there during that report. But I think since that time, and I think particularly with COVID, we've seen, more things added to our kind of list of disruptions, our list of opportunities in some way. But that sense that we are changing, and we're changing fast too. So I think there is this context when we think about inclusive excellence, when we think about how we sustain the higher education offer, when we think about the opportunities that online tools and online models of pedagogy offer us. You know, we are operating in these so-called VUCA conditions, you know, volatility, uncertainty, you know, complexity, and ambiguity. That is our normal, our new normal. Some people have even described it as hyper or super VUCA. So that's the context in which we're thinking about some of these profound changes in this way that we respond to the disruption. So I think, you know, if you were sitting probably around some top teams in universities and colleges, you'd be getting this kind of response that, you know, it's a long way away before we need to think about, you know, those maybe experiments that were going on within our institutions around engagement with online. It was still seen as kind of peripheral. But along comes COVID, and we saw, and I think we are reaping now the changes that COVID triggered for us as we looked to kind of scrabble at the beginning to respond to what was going on. But I think fundamentally it has created a profound shift. There is alongside, you know, the kind of ages of IT and online, we are now seeing this kind of new age when we're thinking about this in a very different way. So COVID has left us with a legacy. Yes, it was a profoundly difficult time for many across the globe, but there is in every disruption, I think, innovation. And we really, as a community globally in higher education, stepped up, I think, and we learned a lot. And I think it's beholden on us to look back at that learning and think about what we can now do to be more deliberate, maybe, in our consideration. At the time, we took a deep dive into what was happening across higher education as we thought to navigate the disruption of COVID. We saw, you know, really, I think, laudable efforts to kind of react very quickly in the moment and get stuff online and just try and meet student needs and faculty needs and staff needs and try and support our students as best we can, you know, working from home. You know, it became clear to us that those disparities, that many people had no home that was safe to work from, no access to things that we may have assumed that they had access to, and the leveling up in many ways that the campus offer, you know, gives students. I think we saw that kind of reaction and it was very laudable. I think what we saw afterwards was the way that we started to respond more deliberatively, in a more kind of proactive way, more strategic, more thoughtful, really kind of deepening, I think, our understanding about access, deepening our understanding about what good looked like, being very grateful, I think, to students for their kind of tolerance of some of our earlier efforts to get things online and do our best in difficult circumstances. But we now saw that response from the sector to become, I think, more professional, more thoughtful in what we were doing. And I think now, and I think that's why this conference is so timely, we're in this position now, being able to reimagine what this shift that was a reactive shift, what can we do now to reimagine how we contribute higher education to transform our world, but in a way that is inclusive, that's sustainable, that really does put excellence in online pedagogy and online delivery alongside our more traditional kind of efforts to this point. So in that article, we looked at a range of different facets, and I don't propose to go through all of them, but I just thought I'd bring out a couple. One is around the different axes where change was happening, fueled by that kind of disruption of the global pandemic. We definitely saw institutions focusing more on thinking about how they can bring in the opportunities that online education offers, alongside their efforts maybe with more traditional classroom-based activities. There definitely was a reawakening, I think, of issues around equity. Some of those were lessons learned hard by simply just being unaware of the challenges that many of our students are navigating using and drawing on campus when the campus was no longer available to them. I think we saw people thinking about how can we invest smartly in digital strategy, accelerate some of those plans that were probably in the works, but what would make a difference now? How can we reorientate maybe some of our capital spending into spending on this infrastructure? And I think we saw institutions focus more on connecting with other stakeholders. Yes, of course, we saw that around our contribution to the solutions for COVID-19, but we saw institutions working with vendors, working with other colleges, really sharing and being very generous with one another through the kind of partnerships, whether it was within a place-based activity or more broadly than that, as well as this sense that learning mattered. It mattered to reaching, yes, our current students, but also how could we deliver some of our skills and knowledge to the communities that we were serving who needed some information or knowledge. So we saw that sense of maybe reminding ourselves of just how important it is to think that learning is something that carries on through life. There were other facets too, I think, that emerged in that time that kind of reminded us of things that we kind of knew about but maybe didn't value as much. So there was a sense of how do we maintain and think through online tools that help us sustain a community, being dispersed to different parts of the globe, different parts of our communities, not having those kind of water cooler moments or that sense of being connected, so how can we create that scholarly community among faculty and staff, as well as creating learning communities with our students. And there was a greater emphasis, I think, on health and well-being. Yes, the stressors of the COVID pandemic, really pushed all of us, but I think there were, within that, I think we've given greater attention to mental health and individual needs. So there was a greater sense of empathy, I think, emerging than we've seen hitherto, as well as thinking about how can we continue to internationalize our efforts. And COVID offered us a lot in that sense of being able to bring global speakers into our classrooms, to engage in conferences such as this that were happening online. So there was a greater sense of some of those things which are kind of important in our universities and colleges, but actually, moved up the agenda because of that sense of disruption. And we're spending more time, I think, now thinking about how do we sustain some of that learning? How do we sustain our efforts? And how do we lead those efforts and think about this as an adaptive leadership challenge? So I think said well by Dave Snowden here, that in that sort of crisis of COVID, we learned a lot, we innovated, we experimented, we were released from maybe some of the dampening effects of seeking permission through committees and other things that that we create in our bureaucracy within institutions. So we innovated at pace, at speed. We got it wrong sometimes, we got it right mostly. There's a huge amount of depth of learning that we need to mine now to make sure that as we are in this stage of reimagining our offer and cementing some of this into our kind of new normal, is capturing that innovation, capturing those experiences, and making sure that we take those forward. So we saw, in the middle of the pandemic, at Harvard, we had a kind of catch up with everybody about what innovations were going on, what sorts of things were people doing. And it was a fascinating dialogue over a couple of days. And so we saw people kind of playing with that new tool of Zoom as it was then, you know, holding up sort of little pieces of A4 with words on them, showing pictures to the camera, or physically using a board, or really thinking about how they can use the background to actually project their slides. So they were really playing with this new tool in interesting ways, and thinking about how that engaged learners, how it didn't, how it kind of brought a sort of liveliness to some of those kind of talking into the sort of dark screen that we're maybe used to. We saw the hybrid classroom, which was an experiment in one part of the university, being much more widely embraced. It was largely restricted to the continuing education offer, and here we saw it really being adopted much more broadly across the institution. And so when we had a sort of what sorts of innovations are you engaging with, you know, these are the kinds of things that people were doing. They were working on their course content, reorganizing it, thinking about you know, what's the best way of delivering this curriculum? How do I change some of that? Maybe how I actually teach the class. They were making some changes. They were changing from lectures to having kind of facilitated seminar discussions or tutorials. They moved their time zones around. They really, I think, thought much more carefully about just assuming that students somehow find their way to build in a learning community, that they were much more careful about navigating that and setting it up and being more conscious of that kind of work. They thought through how they graded, they thought through all sorts of other things, how they used guest speakers. And so there was lots and lots of innovation going on. It was you know, as difficult as it was, there was a kind of excitement about you know, the opportunity, I think, to innovate in our classroom and to challenge ourselves about some of the things that we maybe take for granted in some of those sort of traditional classroom settings. I think we definitely saw a deeper understanding of how the online education offer can help us decouple this kind of consideration of internationalization and decouple it from mobility. So we definitely felt like in some of our classes, they were genuinely global classrooms. We had guest speakers coming in from all over the world. We had local challenges being used as global kind of exemplars. And we were able, because no one could move around and no one could fly about, you know, we were definitely decoupled from this sense that being international or being global meant, you know, that you got on a plane and learned alongside people. Here you had genuinely global communities coming together and sharing really deeply some of their experiences. You know, it was very interesting. I think here, though, you know, within the kind of disruption of COVID, we did see you know, some real challenges about lack of equitable access to the learning tools and support and networks. So I think it reminded me of Tinto and Engstrom's paper that, and we heard it earlier in the conference too, that simply having access to some of these tools, you know, is insufficient. You know, we needed support. We definitely saw teaching assistants, TAs stepping in. We definitely saw people being supported to access the actual kit that they needed, or the Wi-Fi to support it. And I think, you know, colleges and universities did an enormous amount to try and do that. I mean, I know of colleges, and we cited some of those in our paper, that extended their Wi-Fi access throughout their kind of car parking on some of the very large campuses in the US. We saw people actually sending, you know, kit to people's homes. So there was a real sense that we recognized that we had to support our student community in different ways. And it reminds us of this, the sense of the difference between equality and equity. But I think what we're asking for now is how do we liberate and personalize and meet those needs? And some of the speakers have spoken about that already. So really here, it's how do we put this online education offer, and just using Ronald Heifetz's kind of adaptive leadership model, how do we put it at the center of some of our thinking and gather around us the different kind of stakeholder groups that we need to really move this to be not a temporary kind of reaction to a crisis, but a sort of considered, deliberate strategy as part of our university and colleges of higher education, our offer. How can we really put it in the middle as a shift? How can we best mobilize people to face into this new reality, not a temporary shift, but now firmly here to stay? And I think that's part of the discussions that we'll have and part of the commentary here. So it's a profound shift, the shift, we're moving it not only in terms of it being scaled up in terms of online education, we're seeing it being more widely respected. We're seeing it being a source of inquiry around our research efforts. And I think it genuinely has raised the profile of teaching and learning in our institutions. So it reminds me of that sense of our ability now, not to wait for another crisis, but to really consider how we self-disrupt and take the opportunity now to choose, as Viktor Frankl says, how do we best choose now our response to the next iteration of what online education can do for us, what it can't do, where we need to, I think, build new capacities, new capabilities. And actually, I think it does rely on harnessing the opportunity to work more closely with our students to understand, their individual learning needs, to tailor to those, as we've heard. But it also means working alongside, I think, businesses and vendors to be the intelligent client as higher education, and to shape how that technology can fuel, I think, our needs now as a global community. So that power of width, that sense of radical collaboration, with our students, with our staff, with our faculty, as well as reaching out beyond, the boundaries of a physical campus into the businesses and the other stakeholders that are part of our success and help us do the work that we want to do. And I didn't want to leave this session without just mentioning, some of the new kind of opportunities that are presenting themselves, such as the kind of large language models. Is a very timely discussion. There's lots of kind of think pieces, coming out now as we see ChatGPT and others, either presenting a doomsday scenario or presenting, I think, a more balanced view of will we adapt now to as this next iteration of this adaptive challenge around online education and online tools. How will we adapt now to the presence of these, generative AI models, or will we be caught up in trying to resist them? And so there's been some fantastic headlines around about the college essay, getting the generative AI to kind of write so-called college essays for entry, and saying they're better than the average MBA. People calling out that it's it's a mandate for cheating. Or I think where I'm more attracted to, is it really an opportunity now to rethink some of the things that, again, like we did during COVID, some of the things we took for granted, some of the things that we just assumed happened Here we are, and here, as we were during that time, we were really being more deliberate. Is this a way for us to now think through our teaching and assessment again, making our courses more resistant to plagiarism, thinking about more complex tasks, getting people to really work with some of this content, because they'll be doing it, I assume, in their day jobs. You know, can they use and critically evaluate some of the material that's emerging there? So maybe this is you know, a new frontier for us, and rather than thinking about you know, as I know in my own kind of experience, you know, you can't bring a calculator into class, you can't bring an iPhone into class, you can't bring a PC, you know, all of those things that have happened over the history as new technologies have come in. Maybe we are thinking through now, what is the next level here as we start to bring in some of these new tools? You know, how will they add value? How will they help us rethink some of our pedagogy? How will some of those maybe earlier efforts to introduce online education, how will they help us, I think, in this next piece? So let's think about that in a kind of augmented learning model. I'd be very interested to hear more about that. So let's just land this and think through that. Really, we're trying to, I think, here think about how online education as a model, as a suite of tools, as an ever unraveling frontier really helps us deliver of student success, help them to be successful, and really help us, I think, to meet our responsibilities around so the Sustainable Development Goals and education for sustainable development. And I just wanted to highlight that we took a look at some of these issues in a book that we put out this year, which is how can we think through the contribution of higher education to sustaining excellence and being part of the change within our institutions, but also out there in society, and actually catalyzing some of these changes. And I think online education offers us so much to accelerate our contribution to delivering against the Sustainable Development Goals, being more sustainable as institutions, and actually driving change within our institutions and driving change beyond our institutions. So in that, we hear from, you know, a range of 66 different authors across, you know, 24 chapters, about 30 countries, where we hear about the kinds of efforts that higher education is making, not a how to do it guide, but a generous sharing of the kinds of innovations that are happening to drive up sustainable excellence, many of them based around inclusive online efforts. And we conclude that book by giving a kind of 10-point manifesto. And I think some of these are relevant here to our online efforts about recognizing the context and the place of your institution. Its mission will influence how we adopt online education, how we think it through. Clearly, leadership and students and patience matters in this space. But I think where we're going is that the sense of building inclusive spaces for dialogue, such as this conference, building community within our institutions, but also with that broader ecosystem of providers and suppliers and technology and app creators, and recognizing our efforts, whether large or small, you know, really do matter. And it brings me, you know, full circle really to my first point, which is that what we do here matters. So just to leave you with a kind of call to action, this was a kind of best guess estimate from a recent piece of writing about what it would look like in our institutions, you know, that balance between online, blended, campus. You know, it gives us a sense in, you know, different institutions, different archetypes of institutions, different missions of institutions will shift that balance at any one point in time. But really, I think what we're seeing is a moment for higher education to really think through how we embrace the acceleration that came off the back of COVID as we, reacted to move online? How do we now really mine that innovation? How do we take it forward and think through how we can continue to innovate in our curriculum course design, how we innovate using those tools to be more intentional about our pedagogy, and how we really center our discussions around equity and what that offers. So great pleasure to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much for all your efforts, and what you do really does matter. So thank you, Shannon. I will hand back to you and invite any comments or questions.
Thank you so much. We actually are out of time for our presentation today, but if you do have a question, you can put it in the Q&A, and then Dr. Purcell will see those questions and could respond to those via that chat in the session. But our next session is starting in about 4 minutes. And so first, I want to thank Dr. Purcell for her presentation, a very informative presentation on a topic that we all need to be, more mindful of and care about. And so thank you very much for that. And for the attendees, I'd like to invite you to join us at our very next session, where we are going to be talking about is our penultimate session of the day with Manchester Metropolitan University. And they're going to share how they provided intense coaching to support 1,400. So we'll see you over on that side in a couple minutes. So we'll see you at 2:20. Bye-bye.